Hi. Following on that fascinating presentation on cybersecurity, we're now going to delve more, I think, into some of the more social aspects, the job impacts of new technology, how AI is sort of infiltrating all aspects of everyday life. The panel here consists of Dr. Ramesh Srinvasan. He's a professor at the UCLA's Department of Information Studies and director of the UC Digital Cultures Lab. He has a book coming out called Beyond the Valley, which is a look at how digital technologies are being used to benefit and change the work and the lifestyle of a large part of the population. Our next panelist is Dr. Elizabeth Cobbs. She teaches world history at Texas A&M University, and she recently wrote and co-produced a documentary called Cyberworks and the American Dream, and prepare us for the future, which is being shaped by these technologies we'll be discussing today. And my far left is Dr. Stuart J. Olshansky. He's a professor at the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and he's the chief scientist at Lapetus Solutions, Inc., which is a company that he's going to talk to us a bit more about that provides real-life applications of artificial intelligence solutions, and I'll be curious, as I'm sure everyone else will be, to hear more about that. So I think maybe as just an opening thought here, I was going to mention that I was recently up at MIT, and they have a program, and they call it the Work of the Future program, which I thought was interesting. And when I started asking about how they named it, it turned out that there was a lot of thought given to that, because when you say the work of the future, it has an implied question mark on it. Will there be jobs? Will there be work in the future? So they intentionally called it the work of the future because there's going to be work. It's just a matter of what that work will consist of. So with that as sort of a framing, I invite each of you to maybe talk a little bit about your own work and your perspective to sort of frame the conversation. So Ramesh, you want to start?
Hi, everybody. Very nice to connect with you all. I'm a former AI developer who went to MIT. Now, I'm not going to say when, because that dates me a little bit. When I was an AI developer, and I was one of Marvin Minsky's students, amongst other, kind of prominent AI scholars of that time, most people laughed when we brought up the idea of AI. It was sort of seen as more or less a sort of philosophical test, a sort of set of theoretical principles related to the Turing test, right? Can you build a machine that can emulate a human, where a human being could not tell the distinction between the machine and potentially another human? There have been huge qualitative shifts that are responsible for all this conversation now around AI. Companies like Google call themselves AI companies, which is, I think, notable as a sort of branding statement. The major shifts are the following, in my mind, and I sort of lay this out in Beyond the Valley, which is like my book that's coming out next week. And I'll be back here in New York doing like MSNBC and stuff for it. There are three things. One is there's been an exponential decrease in the cost per processing power for computers. That's kind of an obvious point, right? At MIT, we had a computer that was the size of multiple rooms. That is a fraction of the power in terms of processing, and of course, exponentially more expensive than the phones that are in our pockets right now. The second is storage, the storage of data, right? How many of us remember having like a multiple terabyte drive 10 years ago? And very few of us, and if we did have that, it would have been prohibitively expensive. And the third and most importantly are the phones that we carry in our pockets, which are emitting data 24/7, 365 that lives somewhere and is able to be processed because of these technical advances. So in a sense, that opens up a space for a democratization of AI, but it also opens up the much messier questions, which are ones of human values, if you will, economic issues, and political issues. In short, questions around governance of AI technologies. So that brings up issues, right? Like that we hear quite a bit about bias in algorithmic systems, questions around who builds machine learning models, and to what data sets are those machine learning models applied. I give a number of examples in the new book of sort of, if you will, spectacular but at times provocative failures in the application, or false positives of AI technology application, from image recognition algorithms searching for black folk that end up retrieving images of gorillas. I give other examples that you all may have heard of. For another one that I think a lot of people knew about in sort of the mainstream media was when Microsoft built a Twitter chatbot. You'll remember that? Tweets that kind of quickly turned homophobic, xenophobic, and so on. So the question, so these are actually opportunities for learning and governance, and that's kind of what I argue for. I mean, it's unfortunate that they happened, but they're constrained in their impact, which is a good thing. And so what I'm arguing for in the book is really an inclusive approach that we take toward the design of learning technologies, because we always build technologies like any form of expression based on our own, based on who we are. Based on our own implicit biases. I had an opportunity to interview Eric Holder, our former Attorney General, for this book, and we talked quite a bit about implicit bias as something that could be baked into AI technologies and how that could reinforce and normalize inequalities, frankly. So that's one, inclusive design practices. Second is auditing of systems, really carefully thinking about not just the end user as a given individual, but various sorts of communities that might be affected by an AI system. So in Los Angeles, we've been applying machine learning models to predictive policing, but those models are tending to reinforce the issues that are faced by some working communities and communities that are, have been affected by some crime issues in the past for various reasons. So what we don't want are technologies that kind of reinforce the challenges that we face as a society. What we want are technologies that are aspirational. So a lot of what I argue for in the book are what I call aspirational AI, and I kind of lay out what that might look like. So those are a couple components, right? And the other third, which you alluded to briefly, Tim, is the application of specialized AI systems in fields like human resources work, in professional fields. We all like to quote, even though I think the number is sort of a bit out there, the 47% of jobs being automated that The Economist reported out. It's less to me about that, but more about what kinds of work can we identify in relation to automation technologies, what kinds of forms of economic security we want to consider around those issues, and even when we apply specialized AI, for example, to human resources work, we're finding that there was a study published in Science that was reported on by a bunch of media outlets around how science and engineering jobs that are automated, the algorithmic systems are tending to select men systematically over women, again, learning from the implicit biases that exist. So I'm someone who is a former engineer, but now more than anything like an analyst of these themes, a social scientist, and I sort of write about these things, and it's a very surreal moment for me personally, because I sort of came up as an AI kid, as a computer scientist at Stanford. Like a lot of my friends are at, Facebook and Google and so on, and then I went to the MIT Media Lab for graduate school and sort of experienced firsthand these issues starting to occur, and everybody sort of thinking what we were doing was like, out of touch with reality. But now it's come home to roost in a sense. So here's an opportunity for us to get AI right in a social and economic and even political sense. So that's just some opening thoughts.
Well, as you mentioned, I have been working for the last year or so on a PBS documentary called Cyberwork and the American Dream, for which we interviewed folks at Stanford and MIT and all the usual suspects on this subject. And I'm a historian, and so in some ways it's kind of odd for me to be on a panel like this, because everyone's talking about the future, right? What's going to happen in the future. But the past is a very powerful predictor of what's going to happen in the future. And as much as we emphasize things that are going to change, we also need to look at the things that are still going to be the same. And what are the practices that we've learned from the past that will help us in the future? So I always think of history as, in a way, especially related to technology and to economic growth, it's a series of recipes. There is a recipe in history. Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme a lot. So we need to understand what the rhymes are. In the United States, we're very worried, as we ought to be. We need to be thinking about AI and its applications, all of which Ramesh has done such a beautiful job of laying out. But we also need to remember that the United States, at its birth, was twinned with the Industrial Revolution. 1776 was not only the Declaration of Independence, but it was also the first commercial steam engine that was sold by James Watts. So we've dealt with a series of industrial revolutions, and we've always managed to sort of work well. Now, by the way, I'm very conscious that I'm saying the United States a lot. I am primarily a U.S. historian, so apologies to all our friends out there who are from other countries. But it's a nation's story, and it's a story with interest and impact for other nations. So in that sense, this goes back to this question of history being a series of recipes. We've dealt with fears of technology from the beginning. The first novel of the Industrial Revolution, the first novel of AI was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. So the race between man and machine, as our panel is titled, is a race that we've been in for a really long time. And actually, the United States, as a country, has been really successful for many, for 3 centuries now, with coping with these trends. Now, the question is why and how? So it was a country, on the far fringe of the known world with relatively few resources at its birth, and yet in short order became, within 100 years, the largest economy and most productive economy in the world. So how'd that happen? A lot of people will look at sort of recipes, and I am a professor, so I've got notes here, so sorry about that, guys, but that's the way it works. In terms of factors for U.S. growth, they were shared by many other countries, but not all of which, however, got through it as well. For example, the United States benefited from immigration and territorial expansion, and so did Argentina and Chile. The United States was built with slave labor, as were Brazil and Cuba. The United States possessed abundant natural resources, and so did Russia and Canada and Australia. So what then accounts for the fairly rapid development of the United States in coping with successive waves of industrialization that every single time eliminated the majority of jobs? So that's the crazy thing. McKinsey and Associates say, well, 60% of jobs will be partially or altogether automated. That is actually the good news. So the question is, how do you keep up with it? So I think the thing which really singularly marked the United States early, and we know this historically in its development, which applies today, was its commitment alone to popular, mass, free, public education. The United States, beginning in the 1830s, had what was called the Common School Movement, which spread outward from Massachusetts and came to embrace almost all of the United States. The idea, and this was Horace Mann was one of the innovators of this, who said, public education is man's greatest discovery, as if it was something to be discovered, but in a way it is a technology of best practices, one might say. Not a mechanical discovery, but a discovery of what's the best way to approach things. So at the onset of the first industrial revolution, the steam revolution, the United States is spreading mass popular education across the country. Now, by the way, state by state, so south of the Mason-Dixon line, our line of slavery in the United States, it took a lot longer for the South to catch up with the North. That's why economic development was more robust in the North for many generations. Obviously, it's begun to turn around. So the Common School movement put the United States in a position which other European countries and Asian countries, African, et cetera, Latin American, did not enjoy until later. British mass public education comes online in the 1890s. That's when the second industrial revolution begins to hit, the electrical revolution. As other countries are moving into primary education, that's for the United States the onset of what's called the high school movement, which is the second wave of the industrialization, which coincides with a commitment to secondary education. From 1890s to the 1920s, the United States is the first country to adopt mass, public, free secondary education. Now, by the way, it's not the best education in the world. This is in no way to claim at all that the United States is superior in its in what it's offering, but to whom it's offering, the scale that it's offering it. This is what singled the United States out and allowed us to cope with these waves of industrialization. So in the 20th century, the United States becomes a country of high school educated people. At the beginning of the 20th century, 6% of the population had high school education. By the 1950s, about 2/3. That's also when, after World War II, most other countries and also post-colonial countries began offering mass secondary education. So the United States is coming online with that as other countries are just, the United States has matured that system as other countries are developing it. So so the United States has a powerful leg up until the third industrial revolution, which is the computer revolution. And in the computer revolution, this is, from the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, is when other countries are beginning to, take this historical recipe for success, not only adopt it, but improve on it, which is great. I mean, we are a global community. And in a sense, there was no reason why the United States might not continue to improve on it. For example, becoming the first country to offer mass college education for free. We have a slight history of that going back to Abraham Lincoln and the development of the land-grant colleges in 1862. I teach at Texas A&M. We are a proud land-grant college historically. But that does not occur, and in fact, what happens is, as we all know, in the United States today, it's very prohibitive to get a college education unless you take on a level of debt that no other generation in American history has had to shoulder. No generation in world history has had to shoulder, because there's no country with comparable levels of debt to the United States. So what we basically see is why this is relevant is not only it's relevant because of how it affects individuals. As jobs are lost and new jobs are created, the question is who will be educated well enough to take those new jobs. Fortunately, we have strong immigration to the United States, although that's obviously been under challenge, because if we don't educate our own people, we will need to borrow them. And we're very fortunate that there are a lot of people who are willing to come here to supplement American educational system. Of course, it's a great disadvantage for our own people. Income inequality is a testament to the growing lack of work readiness of our own population. People with college degrees earn much far higher wages than people with high school or less. But the other thing, and the lastly point I want to make, is this has to do with economic growth as well. And what economists have documented very well since the advent of what are called the PISA tests, the performance of pupils around the world. The United States, when the PISA tests were first came out in the year 2000, the United States was about at the 50th percentile, which was kind of a shock that we realized, whoa, we're like right in the middle of the pack of developed countries. Today, we are below the 50th percentile. And the talk you see in the United States often is, oh, don't worry about the PISA exams because it's all based on rote memorization, which it's not. But whatever, these things are all test-driven. That's one way to approach the problem. Another way of approaching the problem has been modeled by Germany, which encountered what they called the PISA shock in the year 2000, when they figured out that they were significantly below the 50th percentile. Well, Germany revamped its educational programs. Today it is in the 20th percentile and climbing, whereas the United States has continued to fall in PISA percentiles. And what economists show is that there is a very tight relationship between economic development and PISA scores. The countries from 1960 to 2015, which had the highest economic growth rates, also had the highest rates of education. Singapore, Taiwan, Korea, China. So countries which are improving educationally are also improving economically and really surpassing us in economic growth rates. And those things are very tightly bound, as American history shows.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I know we'll probably have lots of questions later on about whether this time is different. I think that's, so the history is very, very relevant to this conversation. Stuart?
All right, well, for the last 35 years, I've been embroiled in a debate about how long humans can live. It's fundamental and foundational to a number of industries. About 10 years ago, I was invited to speak to a group of CEOs from insurance companies, a CEO roundtable. It's actually run by McKinsey. As you might imagine, insurance companies are interested in how long we're going to live. And just so you know, my view, some of my colleagues suggest that we can radically extend our duration of life and have actually used historical trends as the basis for that. And I would actually, and I have argued, that historical trends are exactly what we shouldn't be using to forecast human longevity. So I would argue that there are limitations on how long we can live based on human body design and a number of other attributes, basic genetics and so forth. So 10 years ago, I was invited to the CEO roundtable, and in the audience was Bob Ben-Moshe, who's the CEO of AIG at the time. And he listened to my talk, and he said, you know, in the world of insurance, we have no clue what science tells us about human longevity. And he said, you just gave us insights that we've never even thought of in the world of insurance. One of those insights involved how we use information about individuals to assess risk and place them into risk pools. So there's no better way to understand this than by way of example. So I'm going to do a little test right here. You'll be the person, since I don't want to test everyone here in the audience, you'll be the experimental subject. And I'm going to use a simple example. Elizabeth and I are seated next to each other. These are not trick questions, by the way. Which one of us is older?
I'm not answering that question.
I set him up. I'm just trying to help you out here. Which one of us is older?
You are.
Good guess. How do you know that?
It was a total guess.
Yeah, well, because I asked the question. Which one of us is male?
You are.
All right. So, you know, it seems silly, right, to ask the question how you know that. You would look at me and you would look at the two of us. You might say, all right, yeah, it's pretty obvious. He's older than she is, and this is a male, and this is a female. Well, as it turns out, the human brain is hardwired to detect attributes of individuals that are associated with health and longevity. Gender actually being one of the critical attributes that the human brain is capable of detecting instantaneously. In fact, if I showed you a picture of our two faces and all you could see was sort of the inside, and you didn't have any outward signs of gender, you would actually get it right about 90 to 95% of the time. What my colleagues and I have done, basically, is we've trained computers to essentially do what your brain is capable of doing at a high degree of efficiency. If I put an eye tracker on your eyes, for example, to look at which part of my face you were looking at, I would be able to determine exactly what it is that you're using to make that determination of older versus younger, male versus female, healthy versus unhealthy. You know, how we do this is classic evolution biology and survival. So that's a much longer story. But basically, this information that we acquire through observation is often done simply by looking at somebody's face. Now, when I was presenting at this conference, I showed a picture, and I'll discuss this afternoon when we talk about aging. I was showing a picture of a man and his father right next to each other. And I said, how old is the younger version of these two? And everyone would look at this picture and they would go, well, maybe he's in his mid-50s. And for the most part, that's about how old he looks. And as it turns out, there are very specific changes that occur to the face that are associated with each decade of life. So it's actually not all that hard to distinguish between somebody in their 60s and somebody in their 30s, for example, right? That's what I meant, right? So, it's actually not all that hard to do. And so basically all we've done is we've trained computers to essentially do what the human brain is capable of doing, and we've brought these technologies to bear in a variety of different industries. So one is life insurance, health insurance, financial services. So believe it or not, in the financial services industry, they're basically operating on technology that's about 200 years old. They're asking somebody, how old are you? How long do you think you're going to live? Well, asking somebody how long they think they're going to live is perhaps one of the least appropriate methods of assessing risk at the individual level. There are basically ways of doing this that are far more sophisticated. You take a simple, oh wait, actually I didn't finish my story about these two gentlemen next to each other that I was showing to Bob Ben-Moshe. The guy looked like he was 55 years old. He was actually 70. The picture of the older gentleman next to him was his father, who was 100 years old. As it turns out, the children of long-lived people, and if you have long-lived ancestors, it's entirely possible that you may be aging at a slower rate relative to the average person born in the same year as you, because your face age is coming in at about 10 to 20 years younger than your chronological age. We see it all the time, and you'll talk to Nir Barzilai this afternoon, who studies centenarians for a living. This is what blew Bob Ben-Moshe away. He said, we had no idea that there are ways to assess risk at the individual level that we've never even thought of before. I said, here's another one for you. Do you ever ask anyone who's being underwritten for life insurance, females, when they went through menopause? And he said to me, why would we ask that? And I said, well, it's classic evolution biology. Females that go through natural menopause late, in their late 50s, live significantly longer than females who go through natural menopause in their late 40s or early 50s. There's a longer evolutionary explanation for why menopause is associated with longevity. It has to do with being reproductively active or fecund and passing your genes on to the next generation. But basically, there are attributes of individuals that we know about in the world of science that industries have no clue about today. And so everything that we're talking about here about artificial intelligence and machine learning is making its way into these various industries. It's sort of creeping in. I will tell you that there's a considerable amount of resistance from industries that have been operating in the same way for hundreds of years. And they don't understand the science, they don't know the science. They would ask for proof points, which is certainly appropriate to be doing, but this technology is going to take over these industries within the next 5 to 10 years. And if these companies are not aware of this and they don't begin adopting these technologies, they are going to be left behind, and they will go the way of the dinosaur. So I'll stop there.
So I think everyone can agree we have a remarkable range of perspectives, and I've attended a lot of panels on these topics, and I think this is a uniquely wide-ranging and with very deep insights on perspectives. I'm going to pose just a few questions and open it up, but maybe I start with Elizabeth, and I'd be interested also to hear everyone's opinion on this. But one of the key points about the history of this is that we've seen this all before. Technological unemployment was a fear in the 1930s. But one of the debates now is this time different? And I've heard different perspectives, and I'd be curious, maybe starting with Elizabeth, hearing your view on whether there's something uniquely challenging and, is it uniquely capable technology that we are developing that will actually mean a different outcome in terms of the number of jobs that will be available? I mean, is there something unique about this, what's coming now and evolving with this technological revolution?
Well, obviously, speed is an issue because of the rapidity with which these innovations are coming online, as you just mentioned, right? You can't just sit and wait and continue to do the thing you've been doing for 200 years. But I think that most economists believe, I'm not an economist, but we interviewed many of them for the film that I worked on, believe that that's not going to be necessarily a problem. There's a question of, again, people being prepared for those changes. That is a problem, educationally in the United States at least. But the idea that jobs won't be there is not so much the issue. One of the issues we have is simply that our social safety nets are also quite old. We developed the social safety nets in the United States in the 1930s that we're mostly still using today. So we're not at a century yet, but we're getting close. So that's a problem, and I think some other countries have been more robust and speedier on their feet in terms of responding to the social dislocations that are going to happen, and they always have. I mean, someone in the preceding panel mentioned the Luddites. So, but those dislocations can be profound if the society is not poised to deal with that, and we certainly saw that in the 1930s. You know, the Great Depression, which was started in agricultural areas, started as farmers started to come off the land, and people often look back at the preceding industrial revolutions and say, oh, well, you know, we had decades to adjust to it, so it wasn't that big a deal. Well, it was a pretty big deal in 1933 if you were a member of the Dust Bowl. So that mass migration sparked by ecological catastrophe combined with economic dislocation as a result of disruptive technologies did have a very profound effect in terms of you know, feeding the impulses towards populism, towards Nazism, towards fascism, and I'm talking about the 1930s. So these are issues that are still with us today. So I think that we do have to be flexible. We can't think that, oh, well, this time is you know, unique in the sense that we've never had to deal with such rapid changes, but we have, and we also have to respond to them.
Sure. So, you know, technologies tend to be amplifiers of the forces that drive those technologies, right? And whether that's the, you know, these issues, like I mentioned, of, you know, who builds technology, who monetizes technology, the purposes to which the technologies are applied. And you know, it's extremely important. I have an op-ed coming out next week in the LA Times, like right before my book comes out. It's it's really about how do we ensure that, you know, these incredible transformations with digital technology are ones that serve our overall macroeconomic and public interests as Americans, and then globally the world over, right? I mean, I think you have to always set these technological issues amidst the backdrop of what we see occurring with the populism that's emerging on both the left and right in this country, which is a sense of greater insecurity, economic insecurity, and so on. So but there are lots of issues we can engage with here. I mean, I think you know, AI systems and machine learning systems can be great amplifiers for predictions around risk, for example, for deterministic types of questions, you know, where you can really bound the kind of and constrain the sort of set of parameters to which you apply an algorithmic system. However, on the level, again, on that messy level of a human or society, I'm saying messy because that's sort of how technologists describe the term, because there's so much subjectivity and differentiation in many cases. It's very important at this moment where we see an inflection point occurring with AI and machine learning and automated systems, and even the connection between these sorts of transformations to the gig economy itself, which is a mechanism and part of supplying data to algorithmic systems. That's part of the reason why Uber's valuation is what it is, despite it being not a very cash revenue profitable business. I think that's just an important point to make. So it's in my mind, and you know, this is sort of what I'm trying to argue for in the op-ed, to think about every mechanism that we can, the ones that my colleagues mentioned, mechanisms of thinking about how do we ensure the overall economic health of our society, and much less the world, when it comes to these technological transformations. Because even as sort of a thought experiment, for a business person or someone who's really at the the top dog in monetizing an AI system, if the overall population is so unequal, including the potential customer and consumer base, as a thought experiment, that's actually not going to be good for your business as well. Obviously, it has incredibly negative externalities as well: public health, education, many issues that you brought up. So there are a bunch of themes that we can apply. Some of these are kind of talked about in the tech world that I kind of occupy. Data micropayments using blockchain technologies. Obviously, we here have a political campaign that's more or less associated with one major theme, the universal basic income idea, which has a history that dates back decades, right? It's not sort of a new idea, despite being sort of often thought of as such, right? Andrew Yang's ideas, worker reskilling issues. There's just a lot we can do right now. So I don't feel like I have the deep historical knowledge that you have, but I do recognize the incredibly powerful impacts of these technologies in the here and now and moving into the future. And the past is often a predictor of the future, and we can learn from these lessons from the past, as you mentioned. So I appreciate that.
So Stuart or
Jay, let me give you two sides of this coin here. In the world of public health, we have been working with big data for 50 years. Big data is nothing new to us. We collect everything. I mean, the national health surveys that have been going on, we pull blood, we pull urine, ask a series of questions. I mean, we track you every way possible. What we've discovered during the last 50 years is more is not better. In fact, what we've done is we've taken all this big data and we've stripped away one variable at a time. Does it influence our predictive power? As it turns out, we stripped something away, no impact. We strip something else away, no impact. We keep reducing the amount of big data into something that is very small. Not just small, normal, but small, highly predictive. And what we've discovered is you only need about 7 questions. That's it. 7 questions to assess risk at the individual level. If you're being underwritten for life insurance today, and somebody comes to your home and takes blood and urine and takes 3 months to assess what your risk is at the individual level, what your premiums should be, is taking about, it should be done in about 3 minutes, the entire process. It is not as complicated as we have been led to believe in the world of life insurance and health insurance. Now, on the flip side, we are walking sources of data. So we are going to have, we already have these devices that we can wear on our wrists or other body parts that collect data, and we are rapidly moving in the direction of a health data economy, which I actually consider to be potentially extremely valuable. You may have seen some elements of this in the movie Minority Report. You remember that, where the character walks into a mall, and he's immediately, his eyes are evaluated, and they've identified who he is, perhaps how much sleep he had that night, because his, mattress is hooked up to the internet, and, what his buying patterns were for the last year, and he's immediately hit with all of these advertisements on, what's available to him based on what we think would be his personal interests. This is the way in which you're going to be interacting with your physician, for example, in the future. Right now, you go in and, a week before you are examined by your physician, they'll send you in for blood and urine, right? You all go through this process. It's almost a complete waste of time, just so you know. You pick up very small pieces of information. On occasion, it's useful. But for the most part, and especially for assessing risk for life insurance, it's almost completely useless information. But what will be valuable is if I've got something on my wrist that's collecting my blood pressure, blood sugar continuously, and that data is being fed to my physician, and he or she can look at that and look at the pattern that takes place over the last year and says to me, Jay, why did you get this huge spike in your blood sugar in the 3rd week in December? Or, I mean, I could say third week in December, I could explain why that would be the case, but, why has your sleep pattern been so dramatically changed? So we're moving in the direction of a totally different way in which we will be interacting with our physicians, the way in which we will be interacting with our own health data, and I actually think that we will be in a position to sell our own health data. We should own it, of course, individually, but we also should be able to sell it. And it should be extremely valuable to a large number of industries that are out there that are interested in what's happening to you as an individual in terms of your sleep pattern, your blood sugar, your blood pressure, all of these things that companies, they want to sell something to you. That data is extraordinarily valuable to them, and we are moving in that direction of a health data economy. So, two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, limit the amount of information because you can, and on the other hand, there's all this new, wonderful information that really is going to transform the way in which we live in our world.
Well, thank you very much. That looks like the consistency here is that this time is different, just in the sense of the capabilities and the scope of this technological change and what's going to happen. I'd like to open this up to anybody who wants to ask questions here in the room.
First of all, thank you all very much. Great perspectives. Michael Katowski, I'm with Aeppel AI. As you look at that gap that exists right now, the awareness that exists in this room is extraordinary, but how do you disseminate this? How do you train and enable that next generation of workers?
Well, I would just say, this has been my personal project in terms of trying to reach out through public media, because I think one of the things that's happening is that there's fear-mongering goes on, and it's so easy to stimulate people's fears about AI technology or loss of privacy or all the things that are real concerns, but they don't have to drive us in a way that we're driven, by fear. So in my case, working through public television, working with educational organizations, using cyber work and the American dream, as a way to bring students in, to tell them what is the history of technological evolution, how have we dealt with it, what are the institutional things that we can do that have not only help to spread innovation, support innovation, encourage innovation, and at the same time help our population stay up with it. So I just think we need to do that. This is the great thing about the Global Dream Forum, is that getting these messages out, like as we're doing sitting here right now, what are the health implications? How do we work with the Valley? I know I'm sorry, I'm talking about education again, but I think it is our key.
Yeah, in my mind, there's a lot we can do. I think that often engineering and science education, and specifically computer science education, is seen as, generally speaking, agnostic, right? It's sort of seen as ethically agnostic, culturally agnostic, and politically agnostic. And now we realize that these technological systems are impacting every facet and shaking our society in many different manners. So that again creates opportunities for new models of education. The New York Times, for example, has published a couple articles about the importance of teaching kind of, if you will, ethics-related kinds of concepts and ideas in tandem with computer science education, which means not ethics is like, it doesn't mean just clearing your experiment with the human subjects review board, but it means really thinking about these questions of humanity in relation to the design and deployment of technology, but also its impacts. So you can imagine teaching people basic concepts, whether they're technically trained or not, around heuristics, right? Like basic concepts of how does a machine learning model function? What is, to your excellent point, Jay, about digital literacies as well. Like what data sets are being collected about people? How do we understand our relationship to data, our so-called digital footprints, which were part of what were used along with Facebook data, cross-pollinated to inform Cambridge Analytica's model, among other ideas. So basically what I'm getting at here is there's a whole ecosystem of all things data and digital that surround AI technologies. And I think we can teach those things to give people sort of qualitative senses of their relationship with data, and also understand basic kinds of expressions of value that are encoded into computation that we can actually teach people so they can be leaders in that space. So I think what happens a lot, right, like I'm a professor at UCLA, most of my students are fearful of learning software languages and databases and algorithms. I bring them along, but what I realize is I can get people some of the way there simply by just kind of getting them to understand these things on a qualitative and heuristic level. And I can explain that more, but I just want to say that. There's a lot of opportunities to now merge disciplines in our educational systems, and I think this is a much larger than an educational issue, it's a public issue, and I really love the idea of putting out documentaries, thought pieces, etc., just ways for anyone can learn, Khan Academy, these sorts of ideas, you know?
So, I mean, really good question. I can tell you, we've been in the trenches trying to get some of these technologies introduced into a variety of different markets. It's not easy. Just by way of example, using life insurance as the example, we went to several companies and we said, don't make this process more complicated than it has to be. Allow somebody anywhere in the world to take their cell phone, take a picture, use our technology to assess whether or not they're male or female, because there is a variation in longevity by male and female, to assess their age, to assess their body mass index, and to assess their smoking status. Smoking writes a signature on the face. I said, why don't you just underwrite somebody in about 30 seconds instead of a month? It really shouldn't be more complicated than that. Now, getting these companies to understand that it's possible to do this is not easy, because they are, you know, in the life industry, you have to wait for a certain amount of time to observe deaths, to know whether or not your technology is reliably or accurately predicting duration of life. Now, of course, we've tested our technology by going back in time, decades, applying it to data that we had 30 to 40 years ago and making predictions over the last 30 to 40 years. But these industries and the folks in them are often, well, so I'll just use a single word, they're legacies. And I've been around a table of people at a variety of different industries, especially the life insurance industries, where I refer to the individuals at the table as legacies. So these are people who have been married to this way of doing things for the last 200 years. They're nearing the end of their personal career. They don't want to see any major change that occurs in the way in which they operate because they don't want it to influence their retirement. So they're Luddites. I mean, somebody else used the word earlier today. It exists today. They exist today in many of these industries. And so what we've suggested is bring these technologies in piecemeal. Show them at the simplest level how it can be done, introduce it in a way that is low risk for them. In the life insurance world, for example, use it for young people. You know, if you're, like my kids, for example, are in their early 30s. And if they want to get life insurance that takes them into their 50s, the survival probabilities from 30 to 50 is about 99.99%. So I said for the insurance companies, what are you worried about? They're all going to survive. So underwrite them in 30 seconds rather than a month. You know, what's the big deal here? And getting them to understand that is really difficult because of the way in which they've been operating for a long time.
May I just mention one other really quick thing? I mean, it wasn't directly answering your great question. I just think also there's a lot of social anxiety around issues of privacy as well, and I can't just sort of leave that unmentioned here. You know, I think there's a great amount of value that can come through big data partitions in particularly strategic ways. People can see their own quantified selves, so to speak. They can learn and adapt to those sorts of, which is kind of an interesting thing, what they learn from that. But I think there's also a lot of concerns about where is that data going, who has that data, how long is data being retained, what about the aggregation of data? For example, in the United States, I could buy your credit card records, right? That's what data brokers do. So are those issues that we're okay with? So this is what I mean by governance as well, and I think they're important to bring up.
Which is one reason why good governance is so important. I mean, we have this odd phenomenon of millions and millions of people giving away their data every 2 seconds on Instagram, on Facebook, on
Without,
wherever. I mean, we
without
are-
posting anything, we
yeah,
give away.
Right, right. And we're also giving away just by having the phone in our pockets, right? But I also mean that there is this intentional volunteering of one's private data that happens, oversharing, we might say. But that also relates to the fact that there's a fairly elemental trust in our institutions that they're collecting that data for our good. Now, I say this despite all the fears, because I think that probably, we certainly, if we were in China today, and knowing what we know about how those analytics are used to give people social scores, we would be much less trusting about that sharing process. We might be wearing masks on our face if we were in Hong Kong. So that, however, is based on several centuries of good faith, by mostly good faith, okay, there are exceptions, but mostly good faith by government and by corporations. I say this, the oddity is that I'm usually a kind of a cockeyed optimist, but so when I'm saying we're in for a bruising because of our educational policies, I really am quite serious about it, but I think the opposite of this is how do we sustain this elemental trust that we see our people have in our government despite these, falling confidence levels. Because it's there, otherwise people would not be sharing their data voluntarily.
Actually, I can give you an example of where I think we're headed in a very useful and dangerous direction at the same time, and that's the human genome. So I don't know if you've had your genome sequenced yet. It is possible to have a good portion of it sequenced. It's not that expensive anymore. There is an enormous amount of valuable information contained within there, and we're just beginning to understand the elements and the value of, that's contained within that genome. But keep in mind that, and my colleagues and I have argued you own that data. It's yours. Now, those of us that study aging for a living, we would give our eye teeth to have the genome of Jeanne Calment, the one woman who lived to 122 from southern France who died in 1997. We think contained within her genome is a secret that allowed her to live that long, which is why Nir Barzilai and others are studying the genetics of these centenarians and others, because we think contained within their genome is extraordinarily valuable information. And I think that each one of us possesses that, but other organizations are capable of using it to your personal disadvantage. So just so you're aware, there's two sides to this particular genome coin, and we are heading down both pathways at the same time.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it's interesting, all of you have touched on something. I think of it as sort of the Black Mirror phenomenon, that there is actually a lot of knowledge out there, but it's a lot of misinformation often, or impressions based on popular culture. And it's so important to have folks like you that are digging into these things, writing books, making films, starting companies that are making use of this. So I thank each of you for doing this, and appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.